Well, Kit, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and I will turn it over to you. Uh,
Fabulous. Um, so I'm Kit Wang. I'm a priest serving in the Diocese of New Hampshire, but I live in southern Maine. I've served congregations in Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Western Mass as priest, as a lay leader, and as a director of religious education over the past, well, it's been a really long time. I'm a trans man, and I transitioned after I was ordained to the priesthood. And that's been an interesting process. And so one of the things to know as we sort of go through this stuff is this evening is that language and science change regularly and often, and our usage of them change regularly and often. And I'm going to speak from my experience and hopefully utilize good science, but also know that probably a lot of you are here because you have trans, non-binary, or gender non-conforming folks who are members of your family, friend group, or congregation. And we say in the trans community, if you know one trans person, you know one trans person. Many of us have similar experiences, but the reality is they're often greatly different, and we're all individuals. And there are things in my experience that aren't other people's, and vice versa. So, and the other thing I would also say is I'm not an expert. What I am is a priest who's worked faithfully in mostly small congregations, and I have thoughts as a trans person who works with other trans and gender non-conforming folks. And I am good at finding information and putting it out there. And a lot of my experience before I was ordained was as a teacher and a prevention educator. And for me, this kind of work is safe church training. Those of us who are Episcopalians all have to, who work with kids or work with other humans, have to receive regular training in basically how not to be abusive and how not to. It's a risk management tool at its very minimum. But I would say that for trans and gender non-conforming folks, the idea of safe church goes way beyond just risk management. And I have, the way I've structured this is I want to do a very brief Trans 101. If you've never had exposure to trans people and never done sort of an introductory to trans things, this is going to be very small, and I'll provide some resources on where there's more information. Just know that that's what I really want to do, is to talk about how we as church professionals and lay leaders can create welcoming communities, specifically but not exclusively around issues of trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks. So
yeah. I need to interrupt because I forgot to say,
yeah.
we are recording this. Generally, the This is sponsored by the New England Episcopal Churches. And we take these talks and we put them on our YouTube channel. Does anybody have a problem with that? It's really helpful if we can.
And are you actually recording?
Yes, we actually are. Which I forgot to say at the beginning. Sorry.
I see it now. Thanks. Yeah, that's fine.
So I have some slides, and hopefully we'll move through the first half of them pretty quickly, and then or the first 3/4 of them really quickly, and then have time to have some conversation and questions, which actually will be. What's our end time, Lene?
8:30.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I wasn't absolutely sure. Great.
Yeah, you got time. You want your slides up?
That would be great. Awesome. Let's go back to the beginning. There we go. Okay, so I called this Welcoming Trans and Non-Binary Folks in Church. Actually, I think maybe Lene called it that, which is great. And so I'm going to talk. I'm an Episcopal priest. My liturgical and theological background is Episcopalian, so I will, although this is more generic than it could have been. So I may not have specific information if you're from a different denomination, but I know that there's multi-denominational stuff in the resource list that I have. And we can talk about the resources that folks have available as we get to the discussion part at the end. So can we have the second slide, please, Lene? Okay, everybody's done that, right? If you can easily change your name to put your name and your pronouns in your square, that's lovely. And if you can't, that's okay too. And in the chat to put where you're from geographically and what your context is. And then I think the next slide is the welcome. Yeah, maybe not here. Oh, the group covenant. This is an opportunity for us to just acknowledge that as a group, we're going to assume one another's best intentions. I encourage you to speak from your experience, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I have relatively thick skin, especially in these contexts, and I'm putting myself out here to answer questions. So don't hesitate. Next slide, please. So as Episcopalians, we place a lot of credence on words. You know, we have this worship tool, the prayer book, that is part of our canons and theological underpinnings and canon law. And so I think it's always important to look at what the words really mean. What is welcome, and what are the parameters of welcome? And when I looked it up, welcome comes from the Old English, meaning a person whose coming is pleasing. So I think that's a really helpful frame. How do we treat folks who visit us, whether they're trans, queer, gender nonconforming, or not, as though their presence is pleasing to us and their arrival is pleasing to us? So that's sort of what hangs around, what this all hangs on. How do we create environments where people feel like other folks are pleased to be with them. Next, awesome. Yeah, next slide, please. This is a gathering of faithful folks, and I think it's always important to look at the theological underpinnings. As Episcopalians, we focus a lot of our theological underpinnings on our baptismal covenant, and recognizing and honoring the dignity of all human beings. But I think it's also important to look at the broader context and stories from our context. And I'm hoping that everyone's familiar with the story of Abraham and Sarah entertaining the angels who announced that they would have a child. In this Easter season, we're in the midst of the season of meeting Jesus on the road to Emmaus, remembering that the folks he was walking with didn't know it was Jesus and assumed he was a stranger. And they welcomed him and shared a meal with him. And when he broke the bread, that's when they recognized him. The Ethiopian eunuch is the first Gentile who's baptized in the New Testament. And whether or not you think that the Ethiopian eunuch was trans or just gender non-conforming, and whether or not you think the Ethiopian eunuch had a trans identity, I still think it's an important story for those of us who are trans and gender non-conforming. And then, of course, Matthew 25:40. Whatever you did to the least of these, you did unto me. I think those are all places to hang stories that are part of our framework that encourage the welcome of strangers and folks we don't know well. So the next slide, please. Okay. So I said I was going to do a really brief Trans 101. I sort of specialize in rabbit holes, so my hope is to not get stuck down a rabbit hole. This is the gender unicorn. It's a open source, publicly available. You can Google it online. There are it's a trans educational resource. I will list it on the resource list and put a link to it. It's a useful visual because it sort of has the parts of where we think about where gender and sexuality reside. And it's also important to remember that gender and sexuality are related, but they're not the same thing. So if we start at the gender unicorn's head, we have this little arch, and that's representing the brain, that is gender identity. How does one think about one's gender? I don't know if we can make it bigger. I will have a fabulous. Thanks, Lene. So gender identity, what I will say is there are a bunch of different pictograms out there about gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation and attraction, and they're all imperfect. So it's a matter of picking which one is the least imperfect. I think most of them are linear, which is challenging. But to just the quick recap is gender identity: female, woman, girl, male, man, boy, something else. The gender unicorn has 3 lines that represent each, and you can be anywhere on those lines. Gender expression is kind of what we wear on the outside. Are we feminine? Are we masculine? Are we other? Are we both? It's a double helix that shows up between the gender unicorn's legs is sex assigned at birth. Most of us have a sex that shows up on our birth certificate, which is generally male, female, and some of us in a proportion that's about the same as red-headedness in the general population of humans are intersex, meaning that they have sexual characteristics or parts, either externally or internally or both, that are typically associated with both sexes. And then we have the orange heart and the red heart. The orange heart is who we're physically attracted to. Are we attracted to men? Are we attracted to women? Are we attracted to somebody else? To folks of other genders? Are we exclusively attracted to one or the other? Or do we have a range of our attraction? And the red heart is who we're emotionally attracted to. Are we emotionally attracted to women, to men, or to other genders, or some combination of the above? The next slide is a more graphic representation. It's the gender graph, and its limitation is that it has two poles. One is male, one is female, and everything else is in between. And that's one way of visualizing things. I'm not always sure it's the best way of visualizing them, but there we have it. One of the things I love about the gender graph is the little X's on the graph move. And we could each have a copy of this and move it to set up where we understand our biological sex to be, where we put our gender identity, where we understand our gender expression to be, and where we put the folks we're attracted to. Again, this is sort of limited in that it's a binary with a spectrum. It's very hard to capture three-dimensional things on paper. Okay, so the next one, Renee. Thank you. We often talk about LGBTQIA Two-Spirit Plus, or more briefly, or tend to abbreviate it LGBT or LGBTQ. Again, something else that isn't perfect. I often default to LGBT or LGBTQ plus when I'm speaking. It's a lot of letters and they change, and different people have different interpretations for what they mean, and it's probably all okay. In general, this started out as an acronym about sexual orientation or attraction, and expanded to include the trans umbrella, because even though they're not the same thing, our gender identity is not the same as our sexual orientation or attraction. They're connected, they're often connected in the kind of experience and oppression that is applied upon folks in this umbrella. It's important to remember that you can be trans, non-binary, or intersex, and also heterosexual or homosexual or pansexual or bisexual or queer. But don't assume somebody's gender orientation based on their stated gender identity or gender presentation. So let's see here. I should probably lay out what's in the list. In this list right here, we have L for lesbian, generally a woman who has relationships with other women. Gay, generally men who have relationships with other men, although gay sometimes becomes a bucket list, including lesbians and bisexuals sometimes. Bisexuals, folks who prefer relationships with both men and women. Queer, which is a big bucket that I have another slide about. I for intersex. A for asexual or aromantic. Some folks stick allies in there. I prefer not to because allies are their own thing. And then 2S stands for two-spirit, and plus is all the other things that aren't there. Two-spirit is particular in that if you identify as two-spirit, you're part of an indigenous community where that particular identity is part of that community's life. If you're not part of an indigenous community or part of a community that uses a two-spirit designation, don't use that designation. It's not yours. There are cultures that have, in addition to American indigenous communities, that have sort of third gender set aside populations that have special expectations and responsibilities and roles associated with them. But that's way outside my expertise and the amount of time we have. Next slide, please. So this is the transgender umbrella. I'll read through what's in the umbrella and what raindrops I can see that are dropping on the umbrella. There will be a link to this resource in the resource page so you can find it. But transgender has become an umbrella for kind of all the gender non-conforming categories, including things like drag, both drag kings and drag queens, intersex persons, two-spirit, transsexuals, male to female folks, female to male folks, gender queers, folks who don't feel like their gender identities fit any of those more specific terms, femi-men, masculine women, and some people may meet those categories and not feel like they fall under the transgender umbrella, and that's okay too. The raindrops that are falling on top of the umbrella include cisgender women and cisgender men. Cisgender is a term meaning that your gender identity and expression conform to the gender identity you were assigned at birth. Okay, it means that your birth certificate lines up with how you think of yourself and what you wear, or other ways, external ways of expressing your gender identity. Cisgender is not a dirty word. It comes as a way of creating a word that doesn't have that's not value laden. I think we often think of we're moving away from using words like normal. I was trained as a scientist, and to me, normal is how you determine, it's one way of determining the concentration of solution. So I don't use normal for people. All right, the next slide, please. So this slide is here because I use queer a lot as part of the LGBTQ alphabet soup. And I use queer as an umbrella for an awful lot of things. And this might be the best description I've ever seen about what queer is. And this is Bell Hooks, who says, queer not as being about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but queer as being about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live. Next slide, please. So if we're dealing with folks who have gender identities and expressions that are not male or not female, dealing with pronouns can be complicated. English is a frustrating language when it comes to pronouns, although I will say it may be less limited. We may have more flexibility than languages where words have gender, and a lot of words have gender. So for pronouns, obviously, we're all familiar with the use of he and she. Some of us use the third person singular they, and then there are neo-pronouns. And here's a partial list of them. And the next slide also has maybe a more graphical version of the list. And there is a pronoun resource that I will make sure is on the resource list. So one of the things to remember is you don't have to memorize all the non-standard pronouns and how to spell them and how to pronounce them. The important thing to remember is that they're out there. And if you ask someone what their pronouns are and they tell you, I use z, zir, zirs, zirself, you can say, oh, how do you spell that so I can remember? And then maybe that'll fix in you that they use a pronoun that's not he, she, or they. So can we go on to the next slide? Great. So I've covered a lot of ground, and I think in retrospect, what I need to just do a little mopping up, which is to say that trans folks tend to be folks whose gender identity or, that's important, gender expression don't match up with what they were assigned at birth. For me, the sex on my birth certificate says F, and when I go to the doctors, they will sometimes say to me, you know, what was your sex assigned at birth? And I will tell them a female, but all of my current documents have M's on them, and I identify as male and gender non-conforming. Probably if I were a little younger, I might err more on the side of being gender non-binary and prefer to use they, them pronouns more than I do. But frankly, sometimes I make expedient choices, and choosing to primarily use he was one of those expedient choices. However, be mindful that I think especially with younger folks, there's a lot more gender expansiveness and gender identification that is way less binary, not male, not female, something in the middle that's not necessarily both. And it's important to know that. It's not as important to know all the brass tacks about how that comes about. Pretty much, this is where we are. The important thing is to not make assumptions, to keep an open mind, to pay attention and listen to what other people are saying to you about who they are, to practice using your own pronouns and offering them when you're introducing yourself, to speak from your experience, and to use and model using inclusive and expansive language. And in the church context, that means both for other humans and for God. Because this is about being welcoming, and because it's largely about, I'm thinking about the church context, and I'm thinking about worship and coffee hour and activities. If you're welcoming someone into your space, think about all the things that go into being a good host and employ those. Things like being attentive to the needs and expressed and sometimes not expressed desires and concerns of a guest or a visitor. And the other thing is, when we talk about pronouns and trans folks and gender non-binary folks and pronouns, often we screw up. I screw up, not infrequently. And when you do, and you call somebody by the wrong pronoun or the wrong name, apologize sincerely, but make it short and move on. Because if you hang out there beating your breast and agonizing over what you just did, then the attention becomes about you and it becomes a much bigger issue. So you can beat yourself up over it later, I promise. But you don't really need to. Just, think of ways to do better the next time and do better the next time. All right, may we have the next slide, please, Lene? Okay, so here's a brainstorming exercise. In a church that you're visiting where you've never been before, I feel welcome when. Think about what makes you feel welcome when you're visiting a church for the first time where you've never been. And I invite you to put it in the chat, or if you have something that's not easily chattable, to raise your hand and share with us ways that that you can be made to feel welcome, or that you feel welcome when you're visiting a church. Great, people smile at me. When people welcome, smile, and introduce. People greet and ask our names. When I know where to go. So like if somebody tells you where there's good signage for the bathroom or the parish hall or the exit, frankly. Yeah, I was at a funeral for a parishioner that was being held in a church that was not mine, and somebody asked me, I was standing in the narthex, and somebody asked me where the bathroom was, and I was like, oh, I've been here once or twice. Can I remember where the bathroom is?
I've had churches where I can't figure out how to get in.
Yes, right.
You go to
Right.
what you think is the front door and it's locked.
Yeah. yeah, we moved into the parish hall for the winter, and you know, it was in the bulletin and in the, you know, and in our e-news, and we had a new member who wasn't on the e-bulletin board and didn't get it, and it took her a few minutes to figure out how to get there. So I put a sign up on the door. Right. Being invited to stay for coffee hour, or seeing what social events are available. People greet me and my family as a whole. Yeah, Lori.
I have good friends, lesbian couple with two adult daughters, and one was looking for a church for herself. And every church that greeted her and said, "Oh, who are your mother and father?" she crossed off the list.
Yep. Yeah, so thinking about the language that we use, and you know, inclusive and expansive language isn't only about isn't only about trans and non-binary folks. It's about what assumptions does the language we use about people demonstrate. Absolutely.
Most of the time when
So
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Lene.
Most of the time when I'm talking about formation, I make a point of talking about households, because we all live in a household, even if it's a household of one. We don't necessarily live, when you say family, it has connotations that aren't really there. I mean, my household has my husband and I, my elderly sister-in-law, my trans autistic daughter, and my non-binary 20-something child. It's a very eclectic household. It's not mom, dad, and the kids.
Right. Absolutely. So can we see the next slide, please? And feel free to keep adding to the brainstorm in the chat. So in preparation for this evening, I did a little crowdsourcing on the Trans Episcopal Steering Committee email list. And I asked folks a question. I asked folks 3 questions. And the first question I asked was, when you engage with a new church or worshiping community, what do you look for? And this was the list. The list was worship style, single stall gender or gender neutral bathrooms, is all the small group ministry gendered? In other words, are all the small groups, the men's group, the women's group, the youth group, well, that's the youth group, but anyway, you know, is everything the boys over here and the girls over there? Who do we see leading worship? Is it all white men? Is it a mix? Is it intergenerational? Who's in the pews? Is there diversity? And yes, is the short answer to that. Is there diversity in its many forms? Racial, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, age diversity, family grouping or household diversity? Are there LGBTQ people? Is it a community that cares about accessibility for everyone? Does the website indicate an intention of welcome or inclusion? Are there pride flags, and what do the bulletin boards say? Are people wearing name tags, and are pronouns on at least some of the name tags? Do folks welcome and greet newcomers and invite them to share fellowship at coffee hour? And are folks actually engaging with others at coffee hour? Is the congregation active in the surrounding community? And what are the interactions like between genders and generations in the community? Now, if you look at that list, most of the items on that list aren't overtly related to the issue of being gender non-conforming or trans. There are a few, but a lot of them are really about how we as churches offer hospitality and welcome. So that's an important point to remember, is that if you're a welcoming community, chances are good that it's easier for you to welcome everyone than a community that's not necessarily welcoming and thinks it might be nice if they look like they're welcoming trans and non-binary folks. Does that make sense? And I know, the other thing is, I know a lot of us are introverts, and I hear a lot from people who visit churches who say, I never stay for coffee hour because, that's the introvert's version of hell. But I'm actually now the priest in a congregation where the congregation, they like one another, and B, they actually welcome people. And I've never seen anyone who was new sitting and we sit at tables in the parish hall during coffee hour. I've never seen anyone sitting by themselves not engaged in a conversation unless they made the choice to do that. And it's kind of stunning to me. I'm a bit of an introvert. And it's just I really enjoy it, and it makes me happy that I can invite folks and know that people will engage with them. So can we have the next slide, please? So this is the second of the three sets of anecdotal comments from my friends and colleagues on the Trans-Episcopal Steering Committee. And I asked them, what are signs when you come to a new place that it might be a congregation that welcomes trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks? And their response was the invitation to share pronouns, either with introductions or on name tags. And one of the ways they meant is, if you're in a congregation that's big enough that when you stand up and say, I'm so-and-so and I'm making an announcement about whatever, if you stand up and say, I'm so-and-so, my pronouns are he, they, and I'm going to make this announcement about so-and-so. Again, where group ministries are not solely based on the gender binary, where there are resources for community education on the bulletin boards, on the walls, and on the bookshelves, and that's on a variety of subjects. Are there pride flags or other indicatory visuals on display? Are there folks who appear to be LGBTQ noticeable in the pews? Is there an active ministry with LGBTQ folks in addition to or outside of Pride Month? And is inclusive or expansive language for God and the congregation in evidence? So those are all the specific things that, as I said, this is a small anecdotal group, but anyway, these are things that we look for when we're visiting new places. So the next slide. I thought it was interesting that very few folks who responded to my request actually answered that question. What makes you want to walk right back out the door? And I bet we all have been in places where we've thought that or thought about that. So these were the responses that I got: a lack of diversity, seeing a pride flag on display, but everything being very gendered, and then feeling tokenized or fetishized when folks find out about my identity. And I'm happy to elaborate on that if folks need that. But when a person basically becomes, oh my goodness, we don't have any trans folks. We were really hoping we'd find some, or well, that's probably the simplest way to there might be some more subtle ways that happens, but that might be the easiest explanation. Next slide, please. Okay. You don't worry about seeing that. That's a placeholder. That's basically, that's the resource list. So that's there for me to say to you, there is a list of, it's both credits and the resources that I used for this, and some resources that I use, and some things I found while I was preparing for this, with a lot of links. So that will be available after we're done. And then I would be remiss if I did not give huge thanks to Dante Tavallaro, who's a priest in Rhode Island, who sent me a PowerPoint presentation that he used that I cannibalized. And the Reverend Rowan Larson, they're the rector of an Episcopal church in Bozeman, Montana, who also sent me a presentation that they used. The Reverend Cameron Partridge, who is a rector of St. Aidan's Episcopal in San Francisco and the chair of the Trans-Episcopal Steering Committee, who's been really good at pointing me in the right direction and encouraging me to sort of step out and do stuff that I'm not sure that I want or have the ability to do. To my folks at the Church of St. John the Baptist in Sanbornville, and to my bishop, Rob Hirschfeld, because frankly, I wasn't ever sure. I transitioned after I closed a parish, and after those two experiences, I was not ever sure that I would serve in parish ministry as a priest in charge of a congregation. So so I have to hold those out there, and it's really important and a blessing to have a bishop who I know has my back. So there's all of that. I'd love to open it up for some conversation about this stuff, because that sort of felt like the whirlwind, and I never quite know how much people actually get, and sort of what I left out, because I've learned that I think in a very particular way, and that means that I often make leaps that other people don't follow along with. So I'd love to hear from folks about, what they're doing that's working, or what they're looking for that I didn't talk about, or other things that folks would like to share, because I know that you all have a lot of experience and are in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different geographic places that have access to different resources and different experience.
Feel free to just unmute and ask
Jacqueline.
a question.
If I could share like another don't, I guess, or do or don't, along those lines, and emphasize not to assume people's identities in any way, and including like with the word queer. So like I identify as queer because I don't fit into a bucket. But that word is a difficult word for some LGBTQ plus people. And it was a slur for many years. And so some people will take that word and be like, how dare you call me queer? So don't apply that word. to people who don't identify as queer. Don't just
Right.
use that word. Be like, oh, that's a general word. Don't use that unless you have permission to use that. And also don't ever don't call out someone as trans. If you see someone and you think they might be trans, don't be like, are you trans? No, never, ever. Like they might be trying to be stealth. And there's some trans people who are like proud to be trans and they're out as trans, and that's fine. And other people that are just like, you know what, I transitioned and I want to be the gender I transitioned to. That is my gender. That is how I'm presenting, and that's how I want to be. And even if they're like beginning their transition and it is like obvious because they're beginning, they might just not want to be obvious. And so even if it is, don't bring it up. It's really embarrassing for them and it crushes their soul. So don't do it.
And I know a cisgender woman who gets asked if she's trans all the time. So
Yeah.
that's really uncomfortable for her.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, modeling things like not only, practicing, the model that I used for, hi, my name's Kit, I use he, they pronouns. I haven't seen you here before. And that gives them the opportunity to introduce themselves, to use their pronouns or not, to engage, but also to make sure that that you don't make the assumption that because someone looks one way that you should ask their pronouns, and that someone else who looks another way you shouldn't. Don't only ask the pronouns of the person you think looks like they're gender non-conforming. Make there some equity or parity there.
I have to tell you my pride flag story. My gets started before. My daughter was in an abusive relationship. And she was in rural Vermont. Her abusers rarely let her leave the house. But she could walk down the road, and there was an Episcopal church there that had a pride flag and pride stickers. And she kept walking down there hoping that there would be somebody that she could talk to there. As it turned out, there never was. She just couldn't get out at a time when that would happen. But she knew it was a safe space. And here is a very traumatized girl who is trans and autistic in an abusive relationship in the middle of nowhere. And that flag meant everything to her. It meant there was hope. It meant there was a way out. So don't think that a little pride sticker doesn't have a big impact. It can. It can have a huge impact. And I saw it again here. Goffstown's a small town. We're probably the only queer-friendly church in town. And the fact that we put a pride flag out makes a huge difference to people. People call us up. They tell us, they stop us on the street. They start coming to church sometimes. Even, can you believe that? It says something profound, especially if you're in a place that tends to be more conservative.
Thanks, Lene. I love that story. I don't love what your daughter had to go through to get out of that situation, but I love the.
She's out, she's home, she's safe, she's getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's an amazing story.
And as beautiful as that story is, at the same time, on the flip side of the coin, how do we not make hanging a flag or printing something in a bulletin just performative? Or how do we communicate that it isn't just performative? How do we really, say that we're not just giving you a space in the pew, that you're actually a part of the community here? How do we make that, and how do we communicate that to someone coming into a church for the first time?
Well, I think so. One of the things is, and I was thinking about this sort of in the bigger, in the bigger picture, which is that a lot of it comes back to how do we do, how do we deal with hospitality and welcoming training with the folks who do most of the greeting and the interaction. Do we have conversations with our ushers and greeters about how to appropriately greet people and how to include people in worship? Do we have, some of it's about the culture of the congregation. I've been in congregations where there's been a real commitment to radical welcome and hospitality, which has meant that there is formation in how to welcome newcomers, how to get, and truthfully, the evangelical churches have a tradition of, right, they've got books and manuals and trainings about how to welcome people and how to get people to come back and how to get people to be involved in small group ministries and other things in the church. And a lot of that is about personal contact. And a lot of that is about opening, kind of opening the system. Because I don't know about you all, but I'm going to I know some of your contexts, and I know that in rural communities and small town communities, our churches tend to be smaller. And my experience in northern New England is that they're small churches where almost everybody's been there for a really long time. And if you have a core of people who are active, who have been there for a really long time, we forget to ask new people if they want to participate. And I think that that's really important. Somebody complained at me at some point about, an altar guild directrix complained to me at some point about they didn't have any young women who wanted to be on the altar guild. And I did not say to her, but I thought it in my head, well, that's because when they were, younger and wanted to do it, you didn't have time or room for them because there were plenty of people on the altar guild, and you didn't want to train new people, and you didn't want to. And so now they have time and they're feeling disincluded. And how do we fix that? So I think remembering that the church is a living, moving organism where things change is really important. And Jacqueline.
I think too is also like thinking about churches people are coming from. So in other churches, trans people are very excluded from being able to serve. And gay people in general, like the LGBTQ community, are like, you're allowed to come on a Sunday, but you're not allowed to be in any kind of service position. You can't teach Sunday school. You can't be on like any kind of leadership position. You can't lead worship. You can't be on like singing on a Sunday morning up on the stage or anything like that. You certainly can't be preaching. Like they're not allowed to do anything. And so when we're coming into the Episcopal Church, it's like being asked to be on doing anything right away is like, wait, what? You want me to serve? You want me to be included in this? That is huge. So anything, just asking us right away, can you serve on the altar guild? You know, can you come help serve during coffee hour? Would you like to do that? Hey, we're doing signups for this thing. Hey, we're serving, you know, a meal to the homeless next week. Can you come help us with that? Are you interested in this? Asking them to serve right away is really huge.
I think asking, I think you said the
Yeah.
right word. It's not waiting for people to come to us. We need to ask. And we need to connect with them enough to know to ask about what they're interested in. You know, if you ask me to be in the choir, you know, I've got an essential tremor in my voice. There is no way on God's green earth I'm going to be in the choir, you know. But I do formation stuff all the time, you know, and so it's you got to ask based on what they're interested in, what they love to do, what their passion is. And that's part of just sitting down and getting to know somebody. And that's a coffee hour conversation, as it were.
And it also means if people are asking to do things, there has to be a yes in there somewhere. I mean, there are some ministries that in the Episcopal Church, we're asked to have folks in a congregation for at least 6 months before they do them. And that's a safe church thing. And that has to do with things like teaching Sunday school and serving on the altar and a few other things like that. But there's plenty of other things that people can do that aren't those things in that 6 months. And some of that is to give people, because there's also something about, you know, the small community where somebody comes in the door and you shake their hand and introduce them and say, so we're having our annual meeting next week. Do you want to run for vestry? Maybe that's not so much the... And I think also, you know, remembering to offer, you know, in the Episcopal Church, we now have a renaming ritual that's in our Book of Occasional Services, the most recent edition, the one that came out of the last General Convention. It's officially in there. And I will confess, it doesn't grab me, but I've decided that probably one of the reasons it doesn't grab me is because I'm still using the same name I've used for 30 years, even though I just finally got around to legally changing it. So it just doesn't speak to me in the same way that it might speak to someone who really has done, you know, a 180 and picked an entirely new name. And is looking for a liturgical way to have that recognized. But you know, letting folks know that you're liturgically open to providing rites and rituals that might be around the reaffirmation of baptismal vows, or you know, if somebody can't remember if they've been baptized, doing a conditional baptism, since we don't re-baptize people. You know, there are all kinds of possibilities. In the back of the prayer book, there's what's it called? It's what I used. It's what my spouse and I used in church in 2004 when we got married, to have our marriage recognized. in the Episcopal context we were in, because we couldn't, as a same-sex couple, we couldn't
Blessing of
be
a
married
blessing of a civil
in the
marriage.
Episcopal. No, because we couldn't use a prayer book marriage service,
Oh, okay.
because the bishop had said we couldn't do that. And, had said just that, that gay couples in Massachusetts in 2004, when same-sex, it's the commitment to Christian service.
Okay.
And it's in the back of the prayer book. And it's, there's a lot of breadth and depth to that service. It doesn't, you can do a lot with that service. So, oh, cool. That's great, Kay.
And I have copies of it on, PDFs if anybody wants to see it. It's an easy way to access it. Okay, gotcha, kid.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, looking at, you'll see on the resource list, I've got a couple of, the Unitarians, the UUA has a 6-section online course for congregations looking to develop accessibility and welcome for trans and gender non-conforming folks. It costs money, but it's on their website, and you can just log in and access it if you pay up. You can do it as an individual, or you can do it as a group. And whenever I'm looking for like stuff about expansive language and kind of liturgical stuff that's outside my tradition, I inevitably see what the UUs have going on, and I often look at the United Church of Christ resources as well. And Google is our friend, but learn to be selective about Google.
Yeah.
Lene?
I was going to ask people, what next steps do you think your congregation is ready to do? Is there one thing that you think you all could do in the next year?
Kristen?
Yeah, I've been kind of pushing on this for a long time. We did finally, based on recommendations from my youngest child, found a few websites. There's gaychurch.org. There's one that's called like Clarity, something where you, based on what you put on your website or whatever, that you're affirming that, first of all, that you are an affirming church, not just welcoming, but affirming, that you do have people in the LGBTQ community in your leadership and your vestry, that you're basically stating certain things. And then when people are looking online for churches that align with that, you're listed. So I have gotten us listed on one. One of them doesn't seem to be active anymore, and I'm working on trying to get us listed with the other. I've been also trying to get, they're very open to having, a trans pride flag, but it just keeps not happening. So I keep pushing. So I'm going to just keep pushing on that, because it is, we have, I think every Episcopal church that I've seen has that, and it's kind of silly for us not to have it. And the congregational church next door has it. It's like, I don't want us to be the church that's like, oh, the church that isn't the one that has the right, it's something that's important to us. And so, I'm kind of trying to make it so that, if somebody walks in, they're not going to feel apprehensive or because there's only so much that we can do. Like I thought that list was so interesting, but I don't know that we would be, we have gendered bathrooms. It's not that anybody would object, but we don't have a single bathroom, and I don't know how we would that's a huge thing. But there's other things.
Well, so actually, like, So I'm in a church that has a new hall. The hall was built in 2019. We have very traditional bathrooms. I've been there for a year, so I had no say. But I can't believe that they have, like, you walk into the men's room, there's the sink, there's a little metal divider, there's a urinal, and then there's the handicapped accessible bathroom with a, fortunately, it's a small room, it's got a door, I think. So here are some things you can do. If you have a bathroom like that, I think that the door locks, the outside door as you come in. You could treat that bathroom as a single a single stall bathroom. I'm also mad because the changing table is in the women's room. Not that anybody can remember, the last baby whose diaper was changed in that church is now 6, but seriously, it just totally frosts my cookies. But anyway, so one of the things that you could do is, and I've seen this done, there's a church in Maine that I remember the bathrooms because we did diocesan youth events there, and there were like 3 stalls in the men's room, and 2 of them had urinals and one of them had toilets, and they just unscrewed all the metal stall stuff, and just there's now just a lock on the door, and it's just one really big bathroom. So when they have youth events, the kids go there in gangs and brush their teeth, and then when somebody needs to pee or whatever, everybody sends out and they lock the door. So you can do that, or you can say, you can put a sign up, and using words is good and having pictures is good too. This is a bathroom, there's a stall and a urinal. This is a bathroom, with 2 stalls and a changing table. But as long as there's a lock on one door, if you're the only person, you can take out a lot of hardware, but you can also just use it as a single bathroom.
Okay, that's excellent.
And you can just adjust the signage.
I had this conversation with my daughter the other day. And she pointed out in Europe, none of the bathrooms have these weird half doors that we do. They go all the way up and all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
So I keep thinking, why can't we just change the doors on the stalls so they're regular doors? And then it doesn't matter. You walk in and you go into the bathroom. Because nobody can look underneath, nobody can look over the top. I don't know why in the US we have these weird half doors.
Yeah, it is strange. When I was there in Europe, they would have all basically those big long doors, and they weren't gendered, and then the sinks were outside. So people were wherever they were.
Right.
So, but that's why I would love to have that list, because I think there are some things on it that some people I would like them to at least start thinking about some of them. Some of them will be easy, some of them won't, but at least if they start thinking about them, then we can work towards it.
Yeah, there's a great list on the Unitarian website. You go to the UUA, and it'll be on the resource list. But if you want to look before you get that, and there's a downloadable PDF with like 10 or 15 things that you can do. Oh yeah, Kay says no menstrual products in church, adding them. And it's one of the things I noticed. My 2 favorite breweries in Maine both have menstrual products in the men's room. Well, actually, one of them doesn't have gendered bathrooms, and there are menstrual products in the common area, and the other one does have gendered bathrooms, but there's definitely like accessible space, and you don't have to go like past. The urinals are in their own special area, so you can go into a stall without like having to walk by a row of men peeing. I'm sorry, men's rooms are just the weirdest place in the universe.
Other people, what do you think you could do in the next year?
I saw a lot of name tags.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think sometimes we have to come armed with some stories for the folks who are going to say, why do we need that? Everybody knows everybody's gender, but like, I know in my teeny tiny congregation, I think there are 7 children, and at least one of those children is non-binary. And it would be helpful if on their name tag, they had proper pronouns, and if other people had pronouns on their name tag, so that this young person doesn't feel weird. Okay.
When I started getting vocal about this is when a kiddo in our congregation came out as trans. And people said to me all the time, I can't do this. I can't do they, thems. And so we had a book discussion about a book called How Did They, Them, which was a very easy read. And it's become part of our culture. Now we know this child who was Monica is now Oliver. We got that part. And now Oliver's using he, him. And that seems to be easier. But we made it a culture. Now, I'm not saying we're totally successful. Never think that. There are still people who will argue. But trying to make the culture shift with the book discussion seemed to help us. And I was just thinking that it's probably time to offer that book club again or something similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also reminding people, if they're having trouble with people changing names, ask them how many people call Paul of Tarsus Saul, or how many people call Abraham and Sarah Abram and Sarai, Oh, cool. How do they, them? Awesome.
Other folks?
I think that I'm liking Lene's very to the point, what are we doing in the next year question, but just going back to something that both Kay and Kit have referenced, that congregational culture and what is practical to expect of a culture to change, when to acknowledge that these are difficult words, difficult changes for a congregation to make, or for some individuals in a congregation to make, and sort of where we're putting those kind of goalposts, where we just want to church, and to say that in order to church that you need to do this training, you need to use this language, you need to, where can our expectations be?
I would like to say, I also think, as somebody who's been doing diversity work in other areas for quite a while, is I think one of the things of those of us who are white and heterosexual and sort of haven't faced many of these issues, our culture never taught people like me how to respond to making a mistake, because the culture supported me as a dominant person, even as a woman in many arenas. And so part of what we're all doing now is learning to say, oh, whoops, I goofed on your gender. Our granddaughter, a couple summers ago, I was taking her and a friend who's non-binary to the beach, and I would do really well for a long time. And then all of a sudden it would be time to go. And I'd say, okay, girls. And then we'd all laugh. And I'd say, all right, next time I'm going to try to do that better. But it is a piece that I think there ought to be a sermon on, we all need to practice making mistakes and responding to them. Yeah. How do we grow otherwise? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point. And Kay put Kay's Tara Sawyer's Beyond a Binary God, Theology for Trans Allies, which is it's a pretty accessible book. It might be a book that a congregation could take on as a book club. It's not a difficult read. It's a little, and she does a great presentation of it. So yeah, and on the resource list, there are also 2 articles from Christian Century, one by Austin Hartke, who's a Lutheran, and the other by E.C. Heath, who's a Methodist pastor in Exeter, New Hampshire, whose spouse is also was most recently executive director of our Council of Churches, about life in non-binary skin in the church, and those are great resources as well.
Kyle, I was thinking about your response. I think, if you're not ready to jump into pronouns or something else, what about just jumping into learning to welcome people and connect with them, and those things that apply to everyone, and how to get to know them and bring them into the community, and maybe put up community resources on the bulletin board. That's, you can do some things that are pretty not really in your face, and just tiny. We take baby steps. Because that's what we are.
Well, and I think if you build good muscles about how to be welcoming, just sort of in the more traditional way, when I think about the places who do welcoming well, where their greeters are trained and actually greet people and don't just talk to their friends, and make sure that if it's their first time in an Episcopal church, they know how to use the prayer book if you don't have a all-inclusive bulletin, and if somebody sort of hosts a coffee hour by making sure that everybody's getting food and drink, but also sitting and having a conversation, but also not getting buttonholed by the person who kind of, is known in the congregation for buttonholing people and, whatever. Those are all sort of hospitality muscles that we can all build on and strengthen, and there are, church development materials out there.
I hate to say it, but we're at 8:30. It's a great conversation, and I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope this helps. And I want to thank Kit for the work he's done to take us next steps, whatever those next steps may be for you.
Well, thank you all. And as I said,
I was just going to ask, is your email in something that we've received?
Yeah, it probably, I have no idea, but I will put it on the screen.
Thank you.
So that's my email, and
I love it.
and I have I do have the resource list, and I can edit. I'm going to continue to do a little editing on that, and I'm happy to send that out, and I'm happy to send out the PowerPoint of the slides. and I want to, you know, make sure that it's got good resources and references. But I found there's a book out there called The Gender Book. A bunch of the University of California websites have great Trans 101 stuff. There's a really excellent YouTube video that's about 7 minutes on sort of the Trans 101 basics, and that's a series. So there's all kinds of good stuff out there that popped up pretty unbidden, and it didn't look like there was any gross stuff in the interim. But just, you know, be mindful, like if you're Googling stuff, look at the links and see where they come from, and maybe use that as your guide to possibly some places you don't want to go. I know I get some pretty gnarly stuff on one of my news feeds from some very right-wing anti-trans stuff around the trans athlete situation and whatever. And I've just learned it's like, yep, I just don't even click on those headlines when they pop up, because I can find them someplace else. Well, thank you all for coming. And let's see here. What's the easiest way to get, Lene, do you have does it generate an email list of participants or something? What's the easiest way to get?
No, it doesn't. I'm still learning how to use things, and I haven't quite gotten to that point. So I think the easiest thing to do would be for them to just email you.
Yeah,
since
that's
they have your email address. That's next year's learning curve for my tech is to figure out how to email everybody after the event.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Lene, for asking me to do this. And it's great to see folks from all over everywhere. That's so cool. And from so many different traditions and contexts. So I really appreciate everybody taking the time to do this, and I hope it's helpful.
And thank
And
you
Kay,
all
it's
for
awesome to
coming,
see you.
and I
Been
hope it
too
all
long.
works out. Great.
Been a long time since we met I think we met in Massachusetts, probably at Godly
We
Place.
did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good to see you too. And I will be emailing you shortly with that resource.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And good luck, Lori, with your stuff.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.